The alien armada surrounded Earth. Seconds later, humanity was behind every ship. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, or the quiet of a sleeping ship. This was the silence that comes when 4,200 warships drop out of faster-than-light travel at the exact same moment, surrounding your planet from every direction, and the people around you realize they have nothing useful to say. I was standing at the main observation window of Earth Orbital Defense Command when it happened. My name is Admiral Rhea Vasquez. I had spent 31 years in uniform preparing for threats I hoped would never arrive. In all that time, I had run simulations, reviewed intelligence reports, and sat through meetings that stretched across entire weekends. I had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. None of those imaginations came close. The alien ships materialized in a perfect sphere around Earth. Not roughly spherical, not approximately even. A geometrically flawless sphere, 800,000 kilometers in diameter, with our planet sitting at its exact center. Every ship was spaced at precisely equal intervals from its neighbors. The formation was so precise that our computers initially flagged it as a sensor error. Lieutenant Carla Webb ran the diagnostic 3 times before she looked up at me with pale cheeks and said quietly, "It's real, Admiral." I told her I knew. The Veth had been a name in intelligence briefings for 11 years. A civilization roughly 3,000 light-years from Earth, technologically advanced, expansionist, and profoundly uninterested in diplomacy. They had absorbed 7 other civilizations in the past 2 centuries. Not destroyed them, absorbed them, stripped their resources, relocated their populations to labor colonies, and erased their languages from official records. The civilizations they encountered did not end with a fight. They ended with paperwork. We had known they were aware of humanity for 4 years. We had known they were moving warships toward our region of space for 2. We had not known they would arrive like this. Nobody had predicted the sphere formation. Our best analysts believed they would approach from a single direction, giving us a chance to maneuver, to negotiate from at least one position of strength. Instead, they arrived from everywhere simultaneously. That required a level of coordination across light-years of space that our scientists said was theoretically possible, but practically insane to attempt. The Veth, apparently, did not care what our scientists thought was practical. Commander Ellis Pratt, my head of tactical analysis, walked up beside me with a tablet showing the initial sensor sweep. He was a quiet man, careful with words, and he chose them carefully now. "They came from every vector simultaneously," he said. "The lightspeed delay between the farthest arrival points is negligible. They must have coordinated this jump from multiple staging points over years, maybe decades." "How many ships?" I asked. 4,214. He paused. 17 are larger than anything in our database. The flagship is approximately 6 kilometers long. I looked out the window at the distant points of light that represented a force capable of dismantling our civilization before lunch. The flagship was not visible from this distance, but I knew which direction it was. Our sensors had already mapped it. It sat exactly opposite Earth from the sun, like a dark counterweight to the star that had given us life. "What about our defense grid?" I asked. Pratt hesitated. That hesitation told me everything before he spoke. "Offline. Not destroyed. They broadcast a suppression signal on arrival. Every targeting system we have is reading the same error code. Our weapons can't achieve a lock on any of their ships." The suppression signal was elegant in a brutal way. Our guns still worked. Our missiles were still loaded. We simply could not aim at anything. It was like removing every compass from every ship in a navy before the battle. The weapons were useless, not because they had been broken, but because the enemy had taken away the ability to use them precisely. And in space combat, imprecision was the same as disarmament. Around me, the command center was operating at a level of controlled urgency that I had trained my people to maintain, precisely for moments like this. Nobody was running. Nobody was shouting. Analysts were at their stations, pulling data, running calculations, speaking in low voices to one another. My crew was performing exactly as I had always hoped they would when the worst day finally arrived. What I had not expected was what they were calculating. 3 of my junior officers, people I knew by name and had reviewed performance reports for, were running equations on their secondary screens that I did not recognize. Not because the mathematics was beyond me. I had a strong technical background. I did not recognize the equations because they were not part of any standard tactical protocol I had ever seen. They were working on something that existed outside the systems I had access to. I noted that. I did not ask about it. Not yet. The flagship broadcast arrived 40 seconds after the formation completed. It came on every frequency simultaneously, translated in real time by the Veth communication software they had apparently seeded into our networks years before their arrival, which was itself a deeply unsettling discovery. The translation was perfect. Not accented, not approximate. Perfect, colloquial English, as if someone had spent considerable time studying not just our language but our idioms. The voice was deep and layered, two tones running simultaneously, in a way that human vocal cords could not produce. It said, "People of Earth, your world is surrounded. Your defensive systems have been neutralized. You have 60 of your minutes to begin formal surrender proceedings, after which we will begin the administrative process of integrating your civilization into the Veth Dominion. We encourage cooperation. It produces better outcomes for your population." That was it. No threats of immediate violence. No dramatic ultimatum with special conditions. A bureaucratic announcement delivered over the most overwhelming military display in human history. 60 minutes, and then paperwork. I turned away from the window. My staff was watching me. Not with panic. They were watching me with the particular focused attention of people who have trained for a crisis, and are waiting to see which version of the plan they are executing. I had worked with most of them for years. I knew their faces well enough to read what was beneath the professional calm. What I saw surprised me. There was fear, yes. That was expected and honest. But underneath the fear was something else. It was not resignation. It was not despair. It looked, uncomfortably and confusingly, like concentration, like people running through steps in their heads, like people who had a list and were checking items off it. Dr. Nora Hale, my chief science officer, was typing very fast. She had 3 screens active and was not looking at any of them directly, which meant she was running a program that was feeding her audio cues through her earpiece. Whatever she was doing, she had been planning to do it and was executing smoothly. I walked to her station. I did not interrupt her. I stood beside her and waited. After 40 seconds, she stopped typing. She looked up at me. Her expression was careful, the way a person looks when they are about to say something they have rehearsed. "Admiral," she said, "the response sequence has been initiated." I looked at her for a moment. "What response sequence, Doctor?" She held eye contact with me, which I respected. "The one we were never supposed to tell you about until it was already running. I'm sorry for that. The protocol required it to be compartmentalized above your clearance level. You were kept outside it to prevent any possibility of information leaking to Veth intelligence. My clearance level," I said, "is the highest in this building." "Not for this," she said simply. I should have been angry. Part of me was. But a larger part of me, the part that had spent 31 years learning to read situations correctly, was doing something else entirely. It was adding up the small observations I had collected since the Veth fleet arrived. The junior officers running unfamiliar equations. The absence of genuine panic in a room that should have been dissolving into chaos. Nora's careful, rehearsed expression. And the one fact that stood out above all others. The Veth had surrounded us with 4,214 ships. A number arrived at by calculating the precise quantity needed to cover every possible escape vector at optimal spacing. We had, according to the intelligence briefings I had read, somewhere in the range of 400 combat-capable vessels, and yet my crew was not afraid in the way people are afraid when they are hopelessly outnumbered. "Tell me what you can tell me," I said to Nora. She glanced at the clock on her screen. The Veth countdown showed 53 minutes and 11 seconds remaining. She took a breath. 11 years ago, she began. A program was initiated under a classified budget, classification that most government oversight committees were told was related to planetary asteroid defense. It was called the Quiet Program. Its actual purpose was to build something that the Veth, or any other expansionist civilization we encountered, would never expect. Not because the technology was beyond imagination, but because no species in the known galaxy had ever attempted it at this scale, this quietly, with this much patience. She turned her screen toward me. On it was a silhouette. The shape was not quite like any ship I had seen in our inventory. It was angular where our ships tended to be smooth, and it had no obvious weapon ports, which immediately seemed like a design flaw until I remembered that I was apparently still missing the most important context. "What is it?" I asked. Nora looked at the clock again, then she looked at me, and for the first time since the Veth fleet had arrived, she smiled. It was a small smile, precise and controlled. The smile of someone who has carried a very large secret for a very long time, and is finally, after all that waiting, allowed to put it down. "Admiral," she said, "it is the reason we were never as afraid of this day as everyone assumed we should be." The countdown on the Veth flagship continued. 52 minutes, 51. The clock moved with mechanical indifference. Outside, 4,000 alien warships held their perfect formation, waiting for humanity to accept what they believed was the only possible outcome. And inside Earth Orbital Defense Command, my science officer was smiling. I pulled a chair from the nearest empty station and sat down across from her. We had 51 minutes. I intended to understand everything she was willing to tell me. Before she began, I looked around the room one more time. Old habit. When you have commanded people through difficult situations for 3 decades, you learn to read a room the way a physician reads a patient. The information is in the details, the angle of a shoulder, the quality of focus on a face, whether someone's hands are still or moving. What I saw throughout the command center was something I had not seen in many years of crisis training, in all the simulation exercises, in all the real emergencies I had managed. Every person was afraid. That was expected, honest, and correct. But there was a layer beneath the fear that was not what I usually saw beneath fear in moments like this. Beneath fear, I usually saw either determination, the active emotion, forward-leaning, ready to fight, or resignation, the passive one, the quality of people who have decided the situation cannot be changed and are simply moving through the motions of responding. Both were familiar. Both had their uses and their costs. What I was seeing was something else. It looked like competence, not the performed competence of people trying to appear capable in a crisis. The actual competence of people executing a known process in an unfamiliar situation and finding that the process works. There was a specificity to their focus, a quality of people who know what they are looking at, that told me they had context I did not. My communications officer, a young man named Henry Marsh who had been with my team for 3 years, and who I had never seen look at me with anything other than professional deference, glanced at me once with an expression I had never seen on his face. Not worry. Not the particular deferential anxiety that sometimes appeared when junior officers were uncertain whether they should be doing something differently. He looked at me with something that, over the following 30 seconds, I identified with some difficulty as a kind of steady confidence, as if he knew something I did not, and the knowing had given him a ground to stand on. I noted Henry's face, and added it to the evidence I was accumulating. The Veth countdown moved with its mechanical patience. 49 minutes, 48. Outside, at 800,000 kilometers, 4,000 alien warships held the most perfect military formation I had ever seen rendered on a tactical display. Inside, my crew executed their unknown protocols with the thoroughness of people who had been given a script well in advance and had learned their lines. I thought about what that meant. A program operating above my clearance level, in my own command. The thing I kept returning to was not the breach of my authority, though I would deal with that later and in detail. What I kept returning to was the decision behind it. Someone, years ago, had decided that the information was too important to share along any chain that might leak, and they had been right, that information leaks. Not through malice, usually. Through the ordinary mechanics of being human, through the way people's guard drops in trusted relationships, through the way a secret under enough pressure eventually finds the path of least resistance. They had decided that no chain was safe, and so they had built the program without one. That was a frightening level of operational discipline. It was also, I was beginning to understand, the level of discipline that the situation had actually required. Nora Hale was watching me think. She had the particular patience of someone who has waited 11 years and has developed a refined tolerance for pauses. I looked at the countdown. 47 minutes. "Start from the beginning," I said to Nora. She nodded. She had been waiting to say these words for a very long time, and she had clearly prepared to say them well. The command center hummed around us, every screen active, every person at their post. The noise was controlled and purposeful. Nobody was wasting energy on panic. I had served under 3 presidents and survived 2 wars. I had made decisions that cost lives and decisions that saved them, and I had lived long enough to understand that the most dangerous assumption any commander could make was the assumption that they already knew what was happening. I did not know what was happening, but I was starting to understand that the people around me did. "Start from the beginning," I said to Nora. She nodded, glanced once more at the countdown, then she began to speak, and as she spoke, the shape of something enormous and carefully hidden began to emerge from behind 11 years of silence. The Veth clock ticked down, my officers ran their calculations, and somewhere in the darkness of deep space, in the cold distance between stars where no sensor had ever been pointed, something that humanity had spent more than a decade building in total silence was finally, quietly, beginning to wake up. I listened to every word Nora said without interrupting her. When she finished, I sat still for a moment. Then I asked her one question. "Does it work?" She held my gaze steadily. "We built 4,300 of them," she said. "We tested 6. All 6 performed within expected parameters." I did the arithmetic in my head. You tested 6 out of 4,300. We couldn't test more without the Veth detecting the energy signatures. 6 was the maximum we could confirm without giving ourselves away. I looked at the countdown. 47 minutes. I looked back at her. "And the remaining 4,294, I said, "are untested." "Yes." I took a long breath. 31 years in uniform. Every crisis I had ever faced came down, eventually, to a moment where the information was incomplete, and a decision still had to be made. This was that moment, scaled to a size I had never imagined reaching. "All right," I said, and stood up. Around me, the command center continued its careful, purposeful work. The Veth clock moved, the lights held steady, and I, Admiral Rhea Vasquez, commanding officer of Earth Orbital Defense, walked back to the observation window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, hidden and waiting, was the thing we had built in the dark. I did not know exactly what it would do when it moved. I knew what Nora had told me. I knew the theory, and the design intent, and the 6 successful tests. What I did not know, what no one could know, was whether 4,000 untested machines would perform as promised when the moment finally came. But I also knew something else. Something that the Veth had not accounted for when they designed their perfect sphere, and calculated exactly how many ships were needed to remove every option from the board. They had forgotten that the board was ours. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the observation window. Outside, impossibly far away, the flagship of an empire that had absorbed 7 civilizations waited for our answer. 44 minutes. I turned away from the window and walked back into the center of the room. My crew looked at me. I looked at them. And then I did what I had always done, in every crisis I had ever faced. I started working. Commander Ellis Pratt had once described deep space as the most honest place in the universe. There were no shortcuts in it, no illusions, no comfortable distances. If you wanted to be somewhere in deep space, you had to earn every kilometer. You had to plan, build, sacrifice, and wait. The universe did not care how badly you needed to arrive. It only responded to preparation. Commander Eli Okoro had been living by that principle for 11 years. He was not on Earth when the Veth fleet arrived. He was not in any of the inner solar system's established stations or outposts. He was in a place that did not appear on any official navigation chart, at a location that had no registered name, orbiting a point in the Oort cloud, so far from Earth that a signal sent at the speed of light would take 18 hours to arrive. He had been there for 6 years. Eli was 44 years old and in the best physical condition of his life, which surprised people who assumed that years of isolation would wear a person down. He was a mechanical engineer by training, a systems architect by career, and by the time the Quiet program had recruited him, he had become something that did not have a formal title. The best description anyone had managed was that he was a builder, not in the simple sense. In the deep, comprehensive sense of someone who understood how things fit together, not just mechanically but philosophically, how the reason a thing was built shaped every detail of how it was constructed. The installation had no official name either. His team called it the Shelf. It was a network of 47 manufacturing platforms, arranged in a loose cluster, each one roughly the size of a large stadium, each one operating in near absolute electromagnetic silence. No radio signals, no active sensors, no waste heat that was not immediately captured and rerouted into the production cycle. From the outside, in the darkness of the Oort cloud, the shelf was indistinguishable from a dense patch of ice and rock. That was intentional. Everything about the shelf was intentional. Every design choice, every operational protocol, every communication procedure had been built around a single requirement. Do not be noticed. Eli was standing in what his team called the observation bay, though it was less an observatory than a wide corridor, with transparent wall panels looking out at the closest manufacturing platform. He could see the ships from here, most of them anyway. The nearest 400 were close enough to make out their shapes in the running lights they used internally for crew navigation. They looked nothing like the ships Earth's defense fleet operated. They were angular and dense, built without the smooth aerodynamic curves that Earth ships tended to favor because Earth ships were still designed by engineers who had grown up watching them fly through atmosphere. These ships would never enter an atmosphere. They were built for exactly one environment, one purpose, and one moment. This moment. His communications officer, a young woman named Phoebe Grant, was standing at the data terminal behind him. Phoebe had arrived at the shelf 3 years ago as part of a rotation crew, had requested to stay when her rotation ended, and had become one of the most indispensable people Eli had ever worked with. She had a quality he valued enormously in isolation. She did not fill silence with unnecessary noise. She was filling it now, which meant the noise was necessary. Earth Command has confirmed, she said. Veth fleet arrival is verified. 4,214 vessels in confirmed sphere formation. She paused. They've issued a 60-minute surrender window. Eli did not turn away from the window. He watched the running lights of the nearest ship and thought about what 60 minutes meant at this distance. The light from Earth, if it could reach him instantaneously, would carry news of a planet deciding whether to give up everything it had ever built. And the activation order? He asked. Phoebe's voice was steady. Received and confirmed. 14 minutes ago. Eli turned then. He looked at Phoebe, then at the rest of the small team gathered in the observation bay. There were 9 of them present. The full shelf crew was 216, spread across all 47 platforms, but these 9 were the core team. The people who had been here the longest, who understood the project not just technically but in the full weight of what it meant. They were watching him. He had thought about this moment many times. He had imagined many versions of it, and had always been uncertain how he would feel when it arrived. Afraid, perhaps. Humbled, certainly. He had not expected to feel so very calm. All right, he said. He walked to the data terminal beside Phoebe and looked at the activation interface. It was a simple screen, not dramatic. The program's designers had deliberately avoided anything that looked ceremonial. A ceremonial interface invited hesitation. This was a plain input screen with a standard confirmation sequence, the kind of interface you use to authorize a routine maintenance shutdown. The routine was not routine, but the screen was ordinary by design. Eli placed his hand on the biometric reader. The system verified him. A prompt appeared requesting a verbal confirmation code. He spoke it clearly and without hesitation. The screen acknowledged the input. A progress indicator appeared, quiet and steady, and in the manufacturing platforms outside the transparent panels, nothing visible happened. That was expected. Eli knew what activation looked like from the inside of the operation. From the outside, it looked like nothing at all. The ships did not power up with a surge of light. They did not begin moving immediately. The fold drive systems inside each vessel initiated a preparation sequence that was long, careful, and utterly invisible to any external sensor. He had explained this to the shelf crew during their first full briefing, years ago. Someone had asked how they would know if the activation worked. Eli had said they would know when the ships arrived where they were going, not before. He walked back to the transparent panels and looked at the nearest ship again. The fold drive technology was not something humanity had invented from scratch. The foundational theory had existed in academic papers for 40 years, described by a physicist named Dr. Alton Webb, who had died without seeing his work taken seriously. The theory proposed that space was not a fixed medium but an elastic one, and that a sufficiently energized field could compress the elastic locally, folding the space between 2 points until they were effectively adjacent. not faster than light travel in the traditional sense. The ships did not exceed light speed. They rendered light speed irrelevant by removing the distance. The military application had come later. A young engineer working on asteroid redirection had realized that a fold drive did not need to transport a ship across light years to be strategically decisive. It only needed to transport a ship across a few hundred kilometers, from a holding position to a position directly behind an enemy vessel, in the fraction of a second it took to initiate and complete the fold sequence. The ships did not need to outrun the Veth. They did not need to outgun them. They needed to appear where the Veth did not expect them, at a moment the Veth had not anticipated, and be there before the Veth sensors could register their arrival. The detection lag on a standard fold emergence was measured in fractions of a second, less time than it took a Veth tactical officer to register an anomaly on a screen and reach for a control, less time than a targeting system needed to acquire a new contact and calculate a firing solution. The plan had a name inside the quiet program. They called it the Mirror, not because the human ships would reflect the Veth fleet back at itself in some poetic sense, but because they would appear behind each Veth ship in the same precise, geometric formation that the Veth had used to surround Earth. One human ship behind each Veth vessel, their engines pointed at the Veth exhaust ports, their weapon systems aimed at the most vulnerable point of each alien hull. The Veth had surrounded the planet. The Mirror would surround the Veth. Eli stood at the window and watched the fold drive preparation sequence run inside vessels he could not see activating, in systems that generated no detectable signature, in ships that had never once transmitted a signal that could have led any intelligence network to their location. Phoebe spoke quietly from behind him. Preparation sequence is at 12% across the fleet. Eli nodded. The process would take time. Each fold drive needed to calculate its specific target coordinate with precision, measured to within 50 meters. A fold that emerged inside a Veth ship rather than 50 meters behind it would destroy both vessels and accomplish nothing. The calculation was the most computationally intensive part of the entire operation, and the AI that ran the fleet, which the team called Sable, had been processing the Veth formation coordinates since the moment the alien ships arrived. Sable was not a simple program. Eli had sat in on every design review of its architecture during his second year at the shelf. Its designers had built it around a concept they described as structured paranoia. It was modeled not on the ideal human tactical thinker, but on the most defensively minded human tactical thinkers in recorded history. People who had survived impossible situations by refusing to make assumptions, by planning for outcomes that seemed unreasonably unlikely, by treating every comfortable situation as a potential trap. Sable's core operating philosophy could be summarized in a single sentence that its lead designer had written into the program's foundational logic layer. If it can go wrong, plan for it now. If it cannot go wrong, plan for it anyway. Sable had been given the Veth formation data and 4 objectives, in priority order. First, achieve positional advantage without detection. Second, broadcast the mirror formation on all frequencies to every civilized monitoring body in the region. Third, issue a formal communication to the Veth command structure. Fourth, await instruction from Admiral Vasquez. It was working through those objectives with the systematic thoroughness of a machine that had no capacity for nervousness and no interest in improvising. Eli appreciated that quality in a system he was about to trust with the most consequential military action in human history. Phoebe updated him at regular intervals, 20%, 31%. The ships around him were preparing in silence, and the universe outside the Oort cloud was continuing its business as if nothing unusual was occurring. He thought about the people on Earth who were watching the countdown. He thought about the Veth admiral on that 6-kilometer flagship, sitting with the certainty of someone who had done this 47 times before and found each occasion predictable. He thought about the 7 civilizations that no longer had their own languages in any official record. He had joined the Quiet program because of those 7 civilizations. He had joined it because of 63 years, the number that had lodged in him like a splinter and refused to dissolve. But he had stayed because of the people. 216 people on the shelf at any given time. They rotated in cohorts, some staying for 2 years, some requesting extensions, some staying as long as he had. Every person who arrived at the shelf went through the same process in the first weeks. They understood the mission intellectually. They had read the briefing documents. They knew what they were building and why. Then they arrived in the actual place, and the intellectual understanding became something else, something with weight, because you were no longer reading about the program in a document. You were living inside it, in the dark, at the edge of the solar system, building ships that would matter, or would not, and the question of whether they would matter would be answered only by a day you could not schedule. People changed in that environment. Not dramatically, not in ways that made them difficult to work with, or that eroded their professionalism. They became more patient. They became more focused on the specific immediate problem, rather than on the large abstract goal, because the large abstract goal was so far away that focusing on it was not useful for the mechanics of daily work. They became very good at the ordinary. That was what Eli had come to think of as the program's most significant product. More significant than the ships themselves in some ways. The ordinary. The ability to do excellent work on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing felt urgent, and the goal was 11 years away, and the isolation had been going on so long that it had become the baseline rather than a hardship. The ships were the output. The ordinary excellence was the thing that made the output possible. Phoebe had that quality in abundance. She also had the specific ability to deliver difficult information in the same tone she used for routine status updates, which was not coldness but precision. She had decided, early in her time at the shelf, that the information was always the most important thing in any communication, and that emotional modulation around the delivery of information was a form of editing that introduced distortion. She was probably right. Eli had adapted his own communication style in response to working with her, becoming slightly more direct, slightly less inclined toward the softening phrases he had used earlier in his career. He had not realized this had happened until he went home for his second rotation leave, and his sister told him he sounded different. She could not specify how. Just different. Like someone who had been in a place where speaking carefully mattered. He had thought about that for the entire flight back to the shelf. Because when he had read the intelligence briefings 11 years ago, sitting in a windowless office in an unremarkable government building, the thing that had struck him most deeply was not the scale of what the Veth had taken from those civilizations. It was the speed. Not the speed of the conquest. The speed of the forgetting. Within a generation, the absorbed civilizations had stopped passing their history to their children, not because they were forbidden to, though they were, but because in the administrative reality of Veth colonial governance, the history of your civilization before absorption was not useful. It did not help you perform your labor quota. It did not assist in navigating Veth bureaucratic systems. It was, in the most practical sense, an obstacle to survival. Cultures did not end with explosions. They ended with paperwork. Eli had spent 11 years in the Oort cloud to make sure there would be no paperwork. Phoebe's voice broke his thoughts gently. 58%. Thank you, he said. He looked at the nearest ship in the running light. 4,300 of them, waiting. 6 had been tested. 4,294 had not. That fact was a stone in the back of his mind. He had lived with it since the decision to limit testing had been finalized. He understood the reasoning and had agreed with it at the time. You could not test more than 6 without generating a fold signature that Veth long-range sensors would register. 1 test might be attributable to a natural phenomenon. 2 might be coincidence. 6 was the absolute outer edge of what could be explained away. 7 would have told the Veth that humanity had a fold drive program, and the moment the Veth knew that, the quiet program was no longer quiet, and the mirror no longer had the one quality that made it decisive: surprise. You could build 4,000 ships and lose the war before it started if the enemy knew the ships were coming. The untested majority was the price of secrecy, and Eli had paid it every day for years without finding a way to make it feel less like a gamble. It was a gamble. It had always been a gamble. The people who designed the program had known that and had built it anyway because the alternative, which was to have no answer at all when the Veth arrived, was not a gamble. It was a certainty. Phoebe again. 73%. Eli pressed his hand flat against the transparent panel. The surface was cold. Space was cold on the other side of it, in ways that a person never quite stopped being aware of, no matter how many years they lived in the middle of it. He thought about what came next. The fold emergence would be instantaneous from the perspective of anyone watching. 4,300 ships would not approach the Veth fleet. They would not come from a direction. They would not appear as a wave or a surge. They would simply be, all at once, exactly where Sable had calculated them to be. Every ship behind every Veth vessel, in the same moment, across 800,000 kilometers of space. The Veth would have 1.4 seconds of sensor lag before their systems registered the new contacts. In those 1.4 seconds, Sable would broadcast its communication to the Veth command structure. By the time the Veth tactical officers understood what their screens were showing them, the message would already be arriving. The ships would already be in position. The moment would already be over. The mirror did not win a battle. It ended one before it started. Phoebe's voice was quiet and precise. 91%. Eli looked at the ships and their running lights one last time. He had built them in the dark. He had spent 11 years in the Oort cloud. He had missed birthdays and seasons, and the smell of rain, and the weight of a full gravity that felt like Earth, rather than a station's simulation of it. He had done all of that for this. 98%. He took a breath, let it out slowly. 100%. There was no dramatic sound, no rumble, no light show. The ships in his window simply vanished. Every running light went out at once, as if someone had flipped a switch, and the familiar cluster of silent shapes was gone, replaced by empty darkness and distant stars. Eli stood alone at the panel. The silence of the Oort cloud surrounded him, unchanged, indifferent, and enormous. He had pressed the key. The mirror was moving. Now came the part he could not engineer, could not calculate, and could not test. Now came the 1.4 seconds. Grand Admiral Cethon had conquered worlds. She had stood on bridge platforms that looked out over the broken defense formations of 7 different civilizations, and felt, each time, the same quiet satisfaction of watching a system resolve to its only possible conclusion. Conquest was, at its heart, a mathematical exercise. You identified the resources available to the opposing force, calculated the maximum resistance they could generate, applied your own significantly greater resources at the optimal angle of approach, and processed the outcome. The outcome was always the same when the mathematics were correct. Cethon's mathematics were always correct. She was 412 years old, which made her young by the standards of Veth Senior Command, but experienced by any practical measure. She stood at the central command tier of the flagship Undying Dominion, and watched Earth on the primary display. It was an unremarkable world from this distance. Blue and white, cloud-wrapped, smaller than its reputation suggested. She had reviewed the intelligence profiles extensively before departure. Humans were a young species, barely capable of faster-than-light travel, politically fractured, emotionally volatile, and possessed of a capacity for both cooperation and self-destruction that the intelligence division found simultaneously impressive and irrelevant. They had a defense fleet, a small one. Their orbital grid was now suppressed. Their political leadership was, according to her communications officer, in the process of composing a response to the surrender broadcast. Everything was proceeding correctly. The countdown displayed on her secondary screen showed 41 minutes remaining. She expected the response to arrive well before that. Humans, her intelligence brief suggested, did not endure uncertainty well. They would reach for any available action, rather than wait in silence. A surrender request gave them an action to take and a frame to occupy. They would take it. She was composing her notation for the post-conquest administrative record when her tactical officer made a sound. Cethon had spent 4 centuries learning to read the sounds her officers made without looking at them. There was the sound of routine processing, the sound of confirmed data, the sound of a developing situation, and there was a sound that she had heard only twice in her career, the sound of something that should not exist appearing on a screen. Her tactical officer made that sound. She turned. The display showed contacts, not one, not a squadron, 4,300 simultaneous contacts, each appearing at the exact moment of emergence, each positioned at a distance of 50 meters, directly behind a Veth vessel, each generating an energy signature that matched no weapons profile in the Veth military database. The contacts had not approached. They had not transitioned through any observable travel corridor. They were simply there, between one sensor sweep and the next, as if space had briefly opened and placed them precisely where they had no business being. Her tactical officer said something in a voice she had never heard from that station. "Grand Admiral, the contacts are, they are behind every ship. All 4,214 vessels have a contact directly behind their primary exhaust configuration. Sithan moved to the tactical display. She looked at the formation map. The contacts were marked in the amber of unidentified vessels. Every one of them occupied the same position relative to its paired Veth ship. Not approximately. Not roughly. Exactly. The geometry was as precise as Veth military engineering. It was, she recognized with a clarity that arrived sharply and without comfort, a mirror image of her own formation. The Veth fleet had surrounded Earth in a perfect sphere. The human ships had appeared in a perfect sphere surrounding the Veth fleet. One human vessel behind each of her ships, positioned at the point where an engine discharge at high power would reach the most vulnerable section of the hull. In Veth tactical doctrine, this position was called the terminal approach. It was the position you achieved when you were certain the engagement was ending, and you intended to be the one ending it. It required years of tactical training to execute in a standard approach situation. It required moving your vessel through contested space, matching velocities, defeating countermeasures, outmaneuvering an enemy that was actively trying to prevent exactly this outcome. The human ships had achieved terminal approach on every vessel in her fleet, simultaneously, without traveling through space at all. Sithan was not afraid. Fear was not a state she spent time in, but she was, for the first time in a very long time, in the presence of something she had not anticipated, and she processed that experience the way a machine processes an unexpected input, by pausing, running a verification cycle, and then acknowledging the data. The data was verified. The contacts were real. Her communications officer spoke then, and the words arrived with the particular quality of something that had been prepared in advance and delivered on cue. Grand Admiral, incoming broadcast on all frequencies. It appears to be directed at our command structure specifically. Play it, she said. The voice that came through was synthetic, clearly mechanical, but its diction was clean and precise. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a system delivering a scheduled notification. Veth Fleet Command. This is Sable, Systematic Autonomous Bilateral Leverage Engine, operating on behalf of the United Earth Federation. You are surrounded! The vessels currently positioned behind each ship in your formation are capable of fold-drive precision emergence and carry sufficient armament to cause significant damage to your exhaust systems before your tactical software can complete a firing acquisition. I want to be transparent about the situation, because transparency produces better outcomes. You have 60 seconds to acknowledge this communication. We encourage consideration. It produces better results for your fleet. The communication closed. Sithan recognized the final sentence. It was the last line of her own surrender broadcast to Earth, delivered back to her verbatim, with the one substitution that changed everything. Her officers were looking at her, all of them, not with the comfortable expectation of personnel waiting for a routine command in a routine situation, with the particular attentiveness of people who understood that the situation was no longer routine and that the next decision their commander made would be among the most consequential of their lives. She looked at the tactical display again. Her fleet of 4,214 ships, the most precisely arranged military force she had ever commanded, surrounded by an equal number of human vessels that had appeared from nowhere and occupied, with mathematical perfection, the one position from which they had maximum advantage. Her tactical officer was running calculations. She could see the numbers forming on the side screens. She did not interrupt the process. The calculations would complete when they were finished, and interrupting them with a request for preliminary results would produce preliminary results, which were less useful than complete ones, and might lead to a decision made on incomplete data. She had seen other commanders fall into that trap. The pressure of a developing situation created an appetite for information, any information, and that appetite led to acting on data that had not yet resolved into its final form. She had trained herself out of that habit in her first century of command. She had trained her officers to recognize it in themselves and resist it. She waited. Her second officer, Drevath, was not calculating. Drevath was thinking in the way he always thought when a situation exceeded the frameworks his experience had prepared him for. Very still, looking at nothing specific, processing without output. Drevath had been her second officer for 41 years and had the quality she valued most in that role. He did not fill space with premature analysis. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say that was worth the air it required. He spoke now. Grand Admiral, he said quietly. The data package they transmitted. I have reviewed the fold drive specifications. And? They are real. I have had our drive engineers perform an initial review. The specifications are internally consistent and describe a physically coherent system. There are no obvious errors, no deliberate omissions that would prevent replication. The material properties cited match known physical constants. This is a functional technical document, not a constructed forgery. Cthon had already suspected this. The mirror formation was evidence enough that the technology worked. But hearing her engineers confirm that the specifications were genuine and complete meant something additional. It meant the human AI had transmitted not just proof of capability, but the actual means of replication. Anyone with sufficient manufacturing capability could build what the humans had built. Timeline for replication? She asked. Preliminary estimate, assuming a civilization with our current manufacturing infrastructure, somewhere between 8 and 14 years. Dravath paused. Less for civilizations that specialize in the relevant fabrication processes. The Rorathi, for instance, already operate crystal synthesis facilities of the required type. They would be closer to 6 years. 6 years. The gap between the known and the replicable was 6 years for some civilizations already in possession of the specifications. And those specifications were now in the hands of 17 monitoring parties. She thought about this in the calm way she thought about strategic mathematics. The Veth advantage in this region had been compounding for 2 centuries. Advantages compound when they are maintained. The moment the underlying capability became widely accessible, the compounding stopped. What remained was still considerable. 2 centuries of experience, of developed doctrine, of administered territory and established relationships. That did not evaporate because a technology became available, but it stopped growing in the specific way it had been growing. The sable voice had been precise in its framing. Cthon understood. Now, why? The decision to publish immediately had not been about sharing generously. It had been about choosing strategically. You published when publishing changed the game in your favor more than holding changed it. You published when the alternative to publishing was a temporary advantage that eventually expired anyway, while the immediate effect of publishing created a permanent shift in how every other civilization in the region calculated its position. It was a good strategy, executed well, under pressure, at the exact right moment. She recognized good strategy when she encountered it, regardless of which side she was encountering it from. Her tactical officer completed the engagement models and delivered the summary without preamble. The numbers were what she had already calculated mentally. Every scenario involving active engagement produced Veth fleet losses between 60 and 78%, before human vessel losses reached 20%. The fold repositioning capability eliminated the predictive targeting advantage that Veth combat doctrine relied on. Standard suppression and saturation tactics, which worked against enemies that moved predictably through space, were ineffective against enemies that could exit their current position and enter a new one before the targeting solution for the current position was complete. She dismissed the tactical officer and looked at the formation display. 4,300 human ships, behind each of her vessels, every one of them sitting in the position that Veth doctrine called terminal approach. In 47 operations, terminal approach had always been hers to achieve. The specific geometry of it, the precise positioning, had always been the culmination of the action phase of an operation. It had always been her ships in that position. The disorientation of seeing it reversed was not emotional. It was structural. Her operational framework had been built on 47 data points, and all 47 data points were now on the wrong side of the equation. She looked at the sable communication flag on her display. The 60-second acknowledgement window had expired many seconds ago. The human ships had not moved. Every scenario her officer was modeling produced the same result. In any engagement that began from the current positions, Veth losses would be catastrophic before the human vessels could be destroyed. The fold drive mechanism that had placed them there would, presumably, also allow them to reposition during an exchange. An enemy that could step sideways through space while you were shooting at the place they had been was an enemy that did not behave within the rules of engagement that Veth tactical doctrine had been built to address. The doctrine was thorough. The doctrine was 4 centuries deep. The doctrine had never required a section for this. She thought about the 7 civilizations. She thought about the mathematical certainty of conquest, the resource calculations, the optimal angles of approach, and the outcomes that were always the same when the mathematics were correct. The mathematics were no longer what she had brought to this engagement. 3 of her ship captains attempted to initiate faster-than-light jumps simultaneously. She did not order this. They acted on their own assessment of the situation, which was an act of initiative she would normally commend. She watched the tactical display as all 3 attempts failed within the same second. Each ship's fold spool disrupted by a precise energy discharge from the human vessel positioned behind it. Not enough damage to destroy the ships. Exactly enough to disable the fold drive preparation sequence and leave the vessels sitting in formation, intact and unharmed, unable to leave. Sable had not allowed the escape. It had prevented it cleanly, without escalation, and the 3 ships were still whole, their crews uninjured. The message was not difficult to interpret. You may stay. You may not leave. You will not be harmed unless you attempt something we cannot permit. Cthon's second officer, a younger commander named Dravath, spoke carefully from the adjacent station. Grand Admiral, 17 allied civilizations are monitoring this engagement on long-range sensors. 3 of them have already received the Sable broadcast. The human vessels have transmitted the formation data and the technical parameters of their arrival method on an open signal accessible to every civilization within range. She absorbed that. They made the technology public. Yes, Grand Admiral, immediately upon achieving formation. That was not a military decision. That was a political one. An enemy that achieved a decisive advantage and immediately shared how they achieved it with every observer in range was not trying to demonstrate superiority. They were trying to make the technology impossible to suppress or to monopolize. Whatever happened next in this engagement, every civilization watching now knew that humans had fold drive capability and had demonstrated it on the largest possible stage. The implications expanded in her mind with uncomfortable speed. Veth dominance in this region depended substantially on the assumption that the Veth technological advantage was insurmountable. If every civilization watching this engagement went home and began attempting to replicate what they had just observed, that assumption would come under pressure within a generation. The Veth's strategic position across the entire region was changed by what had happened in the last 2 minutes. She thought about the intelligence profiles. Emotionally volatile, they had said. Politically fractured. Possessed of a capacity for self-destruction. The profile had been thorough. It had missed something essential. Her communications officer was waiting for her instruction. Her tactical officer was still running scenarios and finding the same results. The Sable 60-second acknowledgement window had ended 17 seconds ago, and the human vessels had not moved. They were waiting. Not with impatience. Not with the aggression of a force that had achieved the advantage and was eager to use it. They were waiting, the way a patient creature waits, with complete stillness and no apparent urgency. That quality, Cthon recognized with a sharpness that had nothing comfortable in it, was not in the intelligence profiles. She straightened at her command position. She was 412 years old. She had conquered 7 worlds. She had never done what she was about to do. She looked at her communications officer and nodded once. The channel to the human command opened. For a moment, she said nothing. She gathered the words she had not needed in 4 centuries and found them in the place where unused things are stored, covered by the weight of everything that had come after. "We are," she said finally, in careful, measured tones, listening. On the tactical display, the human formation held its position, 4,300 ships, behind 4,214 of hers, in silence, waiting. The silence felt different from the silence she was accustomed to. The silence of a conquered people was a final silence, the silence of things that had come to their conclusion. This silence was something else entirely. It was the silence of a conversation that was only beginning. She had never had that kind of silence to sit in before. She did not find it as comfortable as she was accustomed to finding silence. But she sat in it, because the mathematics of the situation offered nothing else. And because the mathematics, for the first time in her very long career, were not hers. They were humanity's, and humanity, she was beginning to understand, had been very quietly preparing them for a very long time. Admiral Rhea Vasquez had imagined this conversation differently. In every simulation she had ever run in her career, the moment of communication with an alien military force happened from a position of either clear advantage or clear disadvantage. You were winning or you were losing, and the conversation followed the logic of that situation. The winning side issued terms. The losing side evaluated them. Concessions were made or refused. Lines were drawn. The shape of what came next was determined. This conversation did not follow that logic, because this situation did not follow that logic. Humanity was not winning and had not won. The Veth fleet was still in position. Their ships were intact. Their crews were unharmed. If the human fold ships withdrew right now, the Veth had every capacity to resume exactly what they had been doing when they arrived. The mirror had achieved position and demonstrated capability. It had not decided anything. That was, Vasquez had come to understand in the 47 minutes since Nora Hale's briefing, entirely by design. The Veth admiral on her screen was not what she had expected. 4 centuries of conquest, and she carried herself with the stillness of someone who had processed the situation and arrived at a place of genuine consideration rather than concealed fury. That was interesting. Vasquez filed it away and kept her own expression calm and open, the face she had practiced for negotiations that mattered. "Grand Admiral," she said, "I appreciate your willingness to speak with me. My name is Rhea Vasquez. I am the senior military officer of Earth's Defense Command. I want to be straightforward with you from the beginning of this conversation, because I think we will get further that way than with strategies." The translation lag was negligible. The Veth communication system was apparently very good. The Grand Admiral's response arrived with the quality of a direct reply rather than a translated one. "You have the positional advantage in this engagement," Sithon said. "Straightforwardness costs you nothing." "That's true," Vasquez said. "But I would offer it anyway, because the advantage isn't the point of why we're talking." A brief pause. "State your meaning." Vasquez had thought carefully about this. She had thought about it for the better part of 30 years, in a general sense, and for the past 40 minutes specifically. The words she said in this conversation would shape not just the outcome of today, but the shape of every interaction between these two civilizations for generations. She did not have notes. She had chosen not to write this down, because written notes gave you something to read instead of something to feel, and what she needed to communicate was not a policy position, but a fundamental truth about what humanity was. "The ships surrounding your fleet will not fire on you," she said. "Not today. Not as a first action. Not without provocation that leaves us no other reasonable response. This is not a negotiating position. It is a statement of intent. I want you to hear it plainly." Sithon was quiet for a moment. "Then what is the purpose of this display?" "Information," Vasquez said. "We wanted you to know what we are capable of. We wanted every civilization watching this engagement to know it as well. That is why Sable transmitted the technical parameters of the fold drive openly. We are not trying to keep a secret advantage. We are trying to end the value of secret advantages altogether." The Grand Admiral's expression shifted very slightly. Vasquez was not expert at reading Veth body language, but she was expert at reading the body language of beings who were recalibrating. "You shared the technology openly," Sithon said, in the middle of an active confrontation. "Yes. That is not a military decision." "No," Vasquez agreed. "It is not." Another pause, longer this time. "Why?" Vasquez leaned forward slightly. This was the question she had been waiting for, not because she had staged the conversation to arrive here, but because it was the honest question, the one that got to the core of why this day was not going to end the way the Veth had designed it to end. "Because the problem we are trying to solve is not this engagement," she said. "This engagement will end one way or another in the next few hours. That is not the problem. The problem is the 11 years after today, and the generation after that, and the century after that. If we keep the fold drive private, another civilization like yours arrives in 50 years, and the situation starts over. If we publish it, the entire game changes. Not because everyone builds fold ships. Some will, and some won't. Because everyone now knows that appearing where you are least expected is possible, which means everyone now has to consider that they might be the one who is surrounded." She held Sithon's gaze across the distance between their ships. The Grand Admiral was very still. In human terms, the stillness would indicate deep thought, or possibly shock. In Veth terms, Vasquez was not certain. She stored the observation and continued. "The 7 civilizations your empire absorbed did not fight you because they could not," she said. "Your intelligence files on humanity probably describe us similarly. Smaller fleet, shorter range, less sophisticated drive systems, politically divided, inconsistent in our strategic planning. All of that is accurate in the contexts where you measured it. What the files did not capture, because there was no external evidence to capture it from, was what we were doing in the contexts where nobody was measuring, Sithon said. The quiet program. The quiet program is what we did when we understood that the contexts where you measure us would eventually include a context like today. Vasquez leaned forward slightly. We are not an unusual species, Grand Admiral. We are a species that learned an unusual lesson early in our development. We learned it the hard way, more than once. We learned that the gap between the moment a threat becomes visible and the moment it becomes unavoidable is shorter than you think, every time, without exception. The threat that you have time to respond to is never the threat that matters. The threat that matters is always the one that arrives before you have finished deciding whether to take it seriously. She watched Sithon absorb that. The Grand Admiral was not a slow thinker. She was, Vasquez assessed, one of the most capable strategic minds she had ever communicated with, and the fact that she was processing carefully, rather than responding immediately, was a good sign. It meant she was actually considering the framework, rather than looking for the first available counter. You believe the Veth represent that threat, Sithon said. We believe that any sufficiently advanced civilization with expansionist tendencies represented that threat, Vasquez said. You are the first one that arrived. You are not the one we built the program specifically against. That distinction matters. Why? Because it tells you that the mirror is not a response to the Veth specifically. It is a response to the category of situation you represent. And that means the soul accords are not a document designed to constrain you specifically. They are a framework designed to address the category. If the framework works, it works for everyone, including you. Sithon was quiet for a long moment. The soul accords would constrain the Veth's administrative expansion. In some contexts, yes, Vasquez said. Specifically in any context involving a civilization that has adopted the Accords framework and accepted fold-capable vessel construction, which, as of today, includes 17 monitoring parties who are all currently reviewing the specifications. You are saying the window for unconstrained expansion is closing. I am saying it was always going to close, Vasquez said. Technologies propagate. No civilization maintains exclusive access to a fundamental capability permanently. The fold drive would have been developed by someone, in some form, within a generation. We accelerated that timeline by building it and then publishing it. But the direction was always the same. She paused, then said what she had been building toward since the conversation began. What we are offering is a framework developed before the capability propagated, while there is still an opportunity to shape what it becomes. When the fold drive is standard across 30 civilizations, the question of how it is used will be answered by the practices that were established before it became standard. We are trying to establish those practices now. That is why this conversation matters. Not because of today, because of what today shapes. The Grand Admiral looked at her for a long time. You are describing a negotiation that runs ahead of the technology, rather than behind it, she said. Yes, Vasquez said. Every negotiation that has ever been conducted behind the technology has been worse than the equivalent negotiation conducted before it. We have examples from our own history. We would prefer not to repeat them at galactic scale. You cannot build a lasting peace through a secret. You can only build it through a shared understanding of what everyone is capable of. The Veth Grand Admiral was still for a long moment. Vasquez did not fill the silence. She had learned, over 3 decades, that the most important things people needed to say often arrived only after a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Sithon spoke. You have done this before, negotiated in this manner. Many times, Vasquez said. We have done it with each other, mostly. We are not a peaceful species by nature, Grand Admiral. We argue constantly, and disagree about everything, and have spent significant portions of our history causing damage to our own civilization. But we are very good at making agreements that hold, not because we trust each other, because we understand how to structure arrangements where violation is more expensive than compliance. The Grand Admiral looked at something off the screen for a moment, then back. Your AI, Sable. It took 3 preemptive actions against vessels that attempted to jump away. Precisely calibrated. No crew casualties. Yes. That level of precision, in a live engagement, against moving targets, with that response time, Sithon paused. Sable is not a simple combat system. No, Vasquez said. It is not. What is it? Vasquez considered how to answer that. Sable is what happens when you take the most defensively minded minds in human history and build them into a system. It does not attack. It positions. It holds. It calculates consequences. It has one standing objective that supersedes all tactical decisions, including my own, which is? Make sure humanity survives, not wins, survives. The Grand Admiral processed that. Vasquez continued. There is something I want you to understand about how we built Sable, and why. The 7 civilizations your empire absorbed. We studied what happened to them, not the military phases. We studied what happened to their cultures afterward, the rate at which their languages disappeared from daily use, the timeline of how long it took their populations to stop transmitting their history to their children. We measured it across all 7. The average time from first contact with your administrative system to cultural effective extinction was 63 years. Sithon said nothing. 63 years, Vasquez repeated. Not because you destroyed anything, because you built a system that made the old things irrelevant. Survival required adapting to Veth administration. Adapting to Veth administration required letting go of everything that came before it. That is a very sophisticated form of ending something, Grand Admiral. It does not leave ruins. It leaves silence. The bridge of the Veth flagship was very quiet. Vasquez kept her voice level. We built Sable, and the fold ships, and the quiet program, because we decided a very long time ago that we would not go quietly. Not because we are unusually proud or unusually stubborn. Because 63 years is not long enough for a species to accept that it has ended. There are people alive today who were born before your scouts first confirmed our existence. We do not have the cultural distance from our own existence to find the silence acceptable. Something moved in the Grand Admiral's expression. Vasquez could not name it precisely, but it was not hostility. What do you want from this conversation? Sithon asked. A conversation that continues, Vasquez said. That is all. Not a treaty. Not a formal agreement today, with all the lawyers and committees and 17 counter-proposals that will follow. Just a conversation that does not end today. Because a conversation that does not end is the one thing your administrative system has no protocol for. She watched the Grand Admiral's face. After a long moment, Sithon said quietly,
You prepared for us specifically.
No, Vasquez said, and she said it gently, because the answer was important. We prepared for anyone. We did not know it would be you. We built the Quiet program 11 years ago because we understood that the galaxy was large and that not all of it was friendly, and because we are the kind of species that builds redundant systems for outcomes we hope will never occur. We built asteroid deflection programs before any asteroid was threatening us. We built viral response networks before any pandemic required them. We built this because the day when it would be needed was a question of when, not if. The Grand Admiral looked at her for a long time. Then she looked away, at something in the mid-distance of her own bridge, at some thought that Vasquez could not access and would not have presumed to interpret. When she looked back, her voice was quieter than it had been. Your species was never what the intelligence profiles described. Vasquez allowed herself a small, honest smile. Our intelligence profiles have the same problem. We try to describe what we see and we miss what we don't know to look for. That is why conversations exist, to find the parts of each other that the profiles did not capture. She paused. Then she said something she had not planned to say, because it arrived from somewhere more honest than planning. You have absorbed 7 civilizations, Grand Admiral. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I ask it without judgment. In 400 years, has any of them surprised you the way this has? The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. It had a texture to it, the texture of a very old, very certain thing, encountering something it had no category for. Sithon did not answer the question directly, but she did something Vasquez had not expected. She straightened at her command position, in a small and precise movement, and there was something in the gesture that looked, across all the distance of species and culture and 4 centuries, remarkably like respect. We have not concluded this engagement, Sithon said. No, Vasquez agreed. But we are still talking. And that is where everything that matters starts. The communication remained open. Around them, in the vast geometry of space, 4,300 human ships held their positions behind 4,214 Veth vessels. Sable ran its calculations. The fold drives idled, and the silence between two civilizations that had begun as a countdown became something else. It became a beginning. Dr. Amara Singh had spent 22 years studying how species communicated, and 11 of those years not being allowed to communicate with anyone outside the quiet program. She had a talent for finding the thing that was not being said in any conversation, the gap between the words that was often larger and more important than the words themselves. She was currently sitting in a secure communication bay that had been set up in less than 3 hours, watching a Veth admiral work through something that had no translation in her cultural framework. The Grand Admiral had agreed to a broader conversation, one that included technical experts from both sides, and Singh had been her department's immediate selection. She understood why. This was not a conversation that required a weapons specialist. It required someone who could speak about what humanity was, without making it sound like a threat. The Veth admiral she was speaking with was not Sithan. This was a younger officer, a communications and intelligence specialist named Yevrath, who had been selected by the Veth command structure as their primary exchange contact. Yevrath had a quality that Singh had not expected from a Veth military officer. She asked genuine questions. Not probing questions designed to extract tactical information. Questions born from actual uncertainty. The first one arrived before Singh had finished introducing herself. "The system you call Sable," Yevrath said. "It broadcast your full drive technical parameters on an open signal before Admiral Vasquez confirmed the order. Did you authorize that?" Singh considered how to answer honestly. "Sable operates within a framework of priorities we established before this engagement. One of those priorities was that if a decisive positional advantage was achieved, the technical method of achieving it should be made public immediately. We did not give Sable a specific instruction in the moment. We built the instruction into it years in advance." Yevrath studied her for a moment. "You anticipated that there might be a reason to share the technology before you had time to decide. We anticipated that hesitation in that moment might lead us to make a choice that seemed strategically sound and was strategically wrong. If we kept the full drive private, we gained a temporary advantage over any specific adversary. If we published it, we changed the entire strategic landscape of this region permanently. We knew, when we were building Sable, which of those outcomes we preferred. So we removed the temptation to choose the temporary advantage by making the permanent one automatic." Yevrath was quiet for a moment. "That is a very long way of thinking about a very short moment." "We think long," Singh said. It was the most compressed, accurate description of humanity she had ever produced, and she was slightly proud of it. "Your species has a reputation in this region," Yevrath said. "Among civilizations that have observed you at a distance, you are considered. The diplomatic phrasing is unpredictable. The less diplomatic phrasing is erratic." Singh almost smiled. "Both descriptions are probably accurate from a particular angle." "What is the accurate description from your angle?" Singh thought about it seriously, because the question deserved a serious answer, and because getting this right mattered in a way that went beyond this conversation. "We are a species that experienced most of its formative crises before it had the tools to prevent them. Your civilization developed faster than light travel before it developed nuclear weapons, according to our intelligence. Most of the civilizations in this region did. We developed nuclear weapons while we were still confined to one planet. We nearly ended ourselves 4 separate times before we reached the stars. Each of those near endings changed us." She paused. "When you survive something that should have ended you, you carry it differently than a species that never faced that specific edge. We are cooperative in a very specific way. We cooperate most effectively when the alternative is extinction. We are also paranoid in a very specific way. We plan for our extinction the way some species plan for rain. Not because we expect it, because we know what it looks like when it arrives unexpectedly." Yevrath was taking this in with the careful attention of someone building a picture. "The quiet program. 11 years of building ships you hoped you would never need. We also built planetary impact deflection networks before any object was specifically threatening us. We built a distributed biological archive 50 years ago in the event of a civilization-ending pandemic. We maintain automated seed vaults for Earth's agricultural ecosystem in the event of an ecological collapse that is not currently projected. These are not responses to specific threats. They are the permanent habits of a species that learned very early that the universe does not send warnings in advance. Yevroth looked at something off-screen, then back. The fold ships were never primarily weapons. No, Singh said. They were classified under species continuity infrastructure, the same budget category as the impact deflection system. We did not build them to defeat the Veth. We built them because the day we would need a decisive deterrent was a mathematical certainty, and we did not know who would arrive first. That is a distinction your admiral also drew. It is the most important distinction, Singh said. An enemy builds weapons against you specifically. We built a system against any possible version of this day. That is not an act of hostility. It is an act of profound, somewhat exhausting caution. Yevroth was quiet for a moment. Then, with what Singh recognized as the particular care of someone approaching the question they actually wanted to ask, she said, "Sable has a standing order that supersedes your admiral's authority." Singh did not react. She had known this would come up. She had decided, in the car ride to this facility, how she was going to answer it.
"Yes,"
she said.
"What is that order?"
If Earth is destroyed, Sable does not retaliate. It disperses. It carries human genetic archives, cultural records, and agricultural seed data to 200 pre-selected star systems, and begins the process of establishing the conditions for human continuation at each of them. The silence that followed was different in quality from the other silences in the conversation. It was the silence of a concept arriving that did not have an existing category to land in. "You cannot be ended," Yevroth said. She was not asking a question. She was processing a fact. "It is very difficult to end something that has already arranged to continue in 200 places simultaneously," Singh said. Yevroth looked at her with an expression that Singh, despite her expertise in alien communication, could not immediately name. It was not fear. It was something more sophisticated than fear. It was the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that the map they brought to a territory is missing an entire region. "Who else knows about this?" Yevroth asked. "It was published," Singh said. Sable transmitted it with the fold drive parameters when it achieved formation. Every civilization monitoring this engagement received it. Yevroth looked away. Singh gave her the space of that moment. She had learned, in 22 years of studying communication, that the moments when someone was not speaking were often the moments of most significant processing. When Yevroth looked back, she asked the question that Singh had not expected. It arrived quietly, without the structure of a tactical inquiry. It arrived with something that sounded, across the distance of species, like genuine curiosity. "How long have you known we were coming?" Singh looked at her steadily. "We didn't know it was you. We have been watching for signs of approach from any direction for 2 decades. You were the civilization that arrived first. If it had been a different species in that fleet today, the mirror would have been the same. The answer would have been the same. The quiet program would have been the same." Yevroth absorbed that. "You did all of this without knowing who you were building it against." "Yes. Without confirmation that you would ever need it." "That was the entire point," Singh said. "You cannot build a deterrent in response to a specific threat. By the time you confirm the specific threat, the window for preparation is closed. You build it in case. You build it quietly. You build it well. And then you hope, sincerely and genuinely, that you never have to use it." She leaned forward slightly. "We did not want this day to look the way it looked this morning. 4,000 alien ships around our planet is not a good day for anyone in this system. But we wanted this day, if it came, to not be our last one. We wanted whatever came next to be a conversation, not a submission." "And if the conversation fails?" Yevroth asked. Singh answered without hesitation. "Then we have another conversation. And another. We are not a species that arrives at a final conclusion quickly. We argue. We reconsider. We change our minds. We try new approaches. It is occasionally maddening and historically inefficient. It also means we do not give up on a conversation, simply because the first several versions of it did not resolve the way we hoped." She smiled at the Veth officer. "We have been having some of our conversations for centuries. We are comfortable with the long version." Yevroth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Singh did not immediately expect from a Veth military intelligence officer in the middle of a standoff. She said, I would like to understand more about how your species experiences uncertainty. We study it from the outside, but I think we have been measuring the wrong indicators. Singh looked at her with the particular warmth of a researcher who has just found a question they have been waiting their whole career for someone to ask. Then we have a great deal to talk about, she said. And I would like to start immediately. Outside the communication bay, the fold ships held their positions, and Sable ran its calculations, and the conversation that neither civilization had been sure was possible continued into the late hours of what had begun as humanity's worst morning. It was a very long conversation. That was exactly as it should have been. The vote took 40 minutes. Admiral Vasquez had watched the feeds from 12 different monitoring stations, all of them tracking the same thing from different angles. The Veth High Council, broadcasting internally to their fleet command, processing the situation at a speed that suggested genuine urgency on the other side of this engagement. She did not have audio. The Veth internal communications were encrypted at a level that Sable politely declined to pierce, on the grounds that conducting surveillance on an active negotiation partner was the specific kind of action that negotiations were designed to prevent. She had agreed with that assessment and found herself, not for the first time this day, genuinely impressed by the judgment built into a system she had not known existed 48 hours ago. While the Veth Council deliberated, 3 things happened in sequence that Vasquez watched with close attention. The first was that a civilization called the Sathani, a mid-level technological species that maintained observer status in most regional disputes, broadcast a public statement of support for the Sol Accords. The statement was brief and careful, as Sathani communications tended to be, but its timing was not accidental. They had reviewed the Sable transmission, evaluated the fold drive parameters, and concluded that an arrangement which made the technology universally available was preferable to an arrangement in which one species controlled it exclusively. They published their support before the Veth Council had issued any response, which meant the Veth were now making their decision in the knowledge that at least one other civilization had already chosen a side. The second was that a species called the Rorathi, whose relationship with the Veth was considerably less than friendly, transmitted directly to Sable. They did not contact Vasquez or any human representative. They contacted Sable specifically and asked, in terms that were technically phrased but unmistakably enthusiastic, whether the fold drive schematics were being offered as an open license or as a restricted technology sharing arrangement. Sable responded that the schematics were being offered without restriction and that the United Earth Federation requested only that any civilization building fold drive vessels agree to the positional deterrence principle that the mirror had demonstrated, that fold-capable ships would be used to ensure mutual positioning rather than for offensive first contact applications. The Rorathi broadcast their agreement within 4 minutes. Then they published it to 17 other monitoring civilizations. The third thing that happened was that 2 Veth ship captains, on different vessels on opposite sides of the formation, opened separate channels to Sable and asked about crew welfare protocols for extended standoff situations. Not tactical questions, practical ones. Whether their crews could conduct standard maintenance rotations, whether medical transfers would be permitted if needed, how long the human ships intended to maintain position if the Council deliberated for an extended period. Sable answered all questions directly and helpfully, and transmitted the answers on the same open channel, where all the other communications were being published, which meant 17 monitoring civilizations now had documentation of Veth ship captains, treating this as a maintenance situation rather than an active conflict. Vasquez noted all of this and said nothing about it. The 40-minute deliberation ended with a transmission from the Veth flagship. Thon appeared on the screen and delivered a statement in the formal register that Veth communications used for official positions. The translation came through clean and precise. The Veth Dominion would not be endorsing the Sol Accords in their current form. They required modifications. They had specific concerns about the mutual positioning principle that required further discussion. They needed time to review the fold drive schematics independently before agreeing to any arrangement that assumed their accuracy. They were formally requesting an extended dialogue period during which the current standoff position would be maintained by mutual agreement rather than imposed by one party. They were not agreeing. They were not leaving. They were asking to keep talking. Vasquez had been in enough negotiations to know what that meant. It meant the same thing it always meant, when a party that had expected a quick resolution instead asked for more time. It meant they had looked at the situation from every available angle, and had not found one that produced a clearly better outcome than the conversation they had been avoiding. It meant the conversation was working. She responded formally and briefly, accepting the extended dialogue period and confirming that the mirror formation would be maintained as a mutual positioning arrangement rather than a hostile posture, effective immediately upon Veth confirmation. The Veth confirmed within 30 seconds. The fold ships held position. The standoff continued, now with a different name and a different weight. It was no longer an ultimatum and a response. It was a framework. Fragile, new, without precedent in any diplomatic record either civilization possessed, but a framework. Commander Pratt appeared at her shoulder. He had that quality of careful silence that she always appreciated in him, the ability to be present without pressing. 3 other civilizations have requested copies of the Soul Accord's text, he said quietly. Not the schematics, the principles. Vasquez nodded. She had expected that. The schematics were the technology. The principles were the idea behind the technology, the notion that mutual capability was more stable than unilateral advantage. Civilizations that could not yet build fold ships could still agree to the principle. In fact, civilizations that could not build fold ships had the most to gain from a principle that said capability should be shared rather than hoarded. Send them the full text, she said. Sable's version, not the legal draft, the one written in plain language. Yes, Admiral. She turned back to the window. The stars were the same stars they had always been. The Veth formation was still in position, which meant the mirror formation was still in position, which meant that from the outside, this corner of space looked like an extraordinarily elaborate standoff between 2 forces of approximately equal size, arranged in nested spheres around a blue planet. From the outside, it looked like a standoff. From where she was standing, it looked like the first day of something. She was under no illusions about what came next. The extended dialogue that the Veth had requested would last months. There would be counter-proposals and reversals, and moments when the whole arrangement looked like it was coming apart. The 17 monitoring civilizations would each pursue their own interests, some of which aligned with the Soul Accords and some of which absolutely did not. The fold drive technology, now public, would proliferate in ways that were impossible to predict, and some of which would be dangerous. Sable had already, without prompting, begun running projections on how fold-capable vessels in the hands of various regional civilizations would change the strategic landscape over the next 50 years. The projections were complex and not uniformly reassuring. The peace she was standing in was not safe. It was not stable. It was the beginning of something that would require continuous attention and work, and negotiation, and occasional crisis management for the rest of her career and the careers of whoever followed her. Lieutenant Webb appeared at the station behind her. Admiral, the Veth flagship has opened a maintenance rotation schedule with its escort ships. They're planning to be here a while. Vasquez let herself feel, for just a moment, the weight of the day that had begun with 4,000 alien ships and was ending with a maintenance schedule. The weight of it was different from what she had expected. It was not light. It was not the relief of a crisis resolved. It was the particular heaviness of something that had not ended, but had turned. The kind of turning that only becomes clear in the years after the day it happened. She thought about what she had said to Sithon hours ago, about conversations being where everything that matters starts. She had believed it when she said it. She believed it more now. Tell our ships to run maintenance rotations as well, she said. I want this to look like what it is. 2 forces that have decided to stay in place long enough to figure out what they mean to each other. Yes, Admiral. She pressed her hand against the observation window one more time. The cold of the glass was the same cold she had felt this morning, when the Veth fleet was 4,000 reasons to despair. The glass had not changed. The cold had not changed. What had changed was what was outside. Not the stars. The stars were the same as they had always been. What had changed was the silence between them. That silence used to be the silence of being overlooked. A species too young, too fractured, too far from the center of galactic events to be worth addressing. A silence that had felt, to anyone paying attention, like the quiet that precedes a verdict. Now the silence was different. It was the silence of a question being considered, of 4,000 ships holding position around a planet, and not quite certain anymore who was surrounding whom. Of 17 civilizations watching a standoff and beginning to calculate what the soul accords would mean for them, of a 400-year-old admiral on a 6-kilometer flagship sitting with an idea she had not arrived with. It was the silence of something that had not been decided yet, of a future that was genuinely open in a way that futures almost never were. Vasquez kept her hand on the cold glass and looked at her planet. "All right," she said, to no one in particular, and to everyone present. "Now comes the hard part." None of her crew laughed, but several of them almost did. The almost was enough. They got back to work. Eli Okoro had been to Earth 4 times since leaving for the shelf 11 years ago. The first time had felt like visiting a place he remembered from a dream. Too bright, too warm, too full of noise, and the smell of things growing. He had sat on a hillside outside his sister's house, and been overwhelmed by the existence of weather. Not bad weather, just weather. The fact that the sky changed without anyone deciding it would. He had cried, and had not been embarrassed about it, and had gone back to the Oort cloud 2 weeks later, because the work was not done. The second and third visits were shorter and more purposeful. Personnel reviews, technical briefings, 2 meetings he was not allowed to describe in any document that would outlast the classification period. The fourth was not a visit. The fourth was permanent. The shelf was decommissioned 8 months after the engagement at Earth, its manufacturing platforms repurposed for a project that Eli had also helped design, and its crew was dispersed into the broader Deep Space Engineering Corps. Eli came home in November. He now sat in a meeting room on the first jointly operated human Veth station, a structure that had taken 11 months to negotiate and 4 months to build, and which was currently occupied by 47 humans and 61 Veth, and which had, in the 9 weeks since its opening, generated more diplomatic incidents per square meter than any other installation in the region, and also more genuine exchanges of technical information than the previous 40 years of long-range monitoring combined. The Veth engineer across the table from him was named Dreth. Dreth was younger than Eli by Veth standards, which meant roughly a century of operational experience, and had the particular quality that Eli had come to recognize in the Veth technical staff assigned to the station: competent, curious, and deeply uncomfortable with the absence of a clear hierarchy in the working sessions. Veth professional relationships were organized by seniority in ways that were precise and non-negotiable. Everyone knew exactly where they ranked. Joint sessions with humans, who tended to organize professional conversations by whoever currently had the most relevant expertise on the specific question being discussed, created a persistent low-level confusion in their Veth colleagues. It was, Eli thought, one of the more interesting sources of friction on the station. Nobody was being deliberately difficult. They simply operated on different assumptions about how the room was organized. He had been working on how to explain this for 3 weeks, and had not found a way that was both accurate and comfortable. Today he was working on something more specific. Dreth had a question about the fold drive preparation sequence, a technical detail that had been in the published schematics, but whose practical implementation produced inconsistent results when the Veth engineering team attempted to replicate it. The inconsistency was not dangerous. It was a calibration issue, but it had frustrated the Veth team considerably, and Dreth had, after 9 weeks of working alongside Eli, finally agreed to ask for help directly, rather than continue presenting the issue as an area for independent investigation. That had taken 9 weeks. Eli considered it a milestone. They spent 2 hours on the calibration issue. The problem was in the harmonic frequency of the fold calculation processor, which was designed for a specific type of computational crystal that humans synthesized, and the Veth had not previously worked with. Their equivalent material had a slightly different resonance profile. The fix was a simple offset applied during initialization. Eli walked Dreth through it, and then showed him how to verify the calibration without requiring a test fold. Dreth understood it quickly, and asked 3 follow-up questions that were sharp and precise, and saved them both from having to revisit the topic. When the technical session ended, they sat for a moment in the way that people who have been working together for several hours sometimes sit when the work is done, and neither of them has left yet. Dreth spoke first. The calibration issue. Why was it not included in the published schematics? Eli thought about how to answer. Honestly, because the team that documented the schematics used our computational crystal as the standard, and did not consider that other materials with different resonance profiles would require adjustment. It was an oversight. Not intentional. Dreth looked at him for a moment. You did not know what material other civilizations would use. We published the schematics hoping other civilizations would find ways to improve on them. We did not have the time or the knowledge to account for every possible variation. That was part of the intention of publishing them openly. Collaborative refinement produces better outcomes than isolated development. Dreth absorbed that. Then he said, the Sathani have modified the fold calculation sequence to achieve a 17% efficiency improvement. They shared it with 14 civilizations without being asked. Eli smiled. I know. Sable flagged it as a positive development in the morning status report. Your AI monitors the schematics being used by other civilizations? Sable monitors everything relevant to the Soul Accords framework, not intrusively. It watches the public channels where this information is being shared. It is very good at identifying patterns in technical progress. Dreth considered that. Sable has not communicated directly with Veth engineering staff. Sable communicates based on established protocols. If you wanted to open a technical information exchange with Sable directly, it would be happy to participate. It has a standing interest in improving the fold drive calibration documentation. Dreth looked at him with the particular expression Eli had come to recognize as Veth equivalent of surprised interest, a slight settling of the secondary facial muscles that indicated a recalculation in progress. The AI has interests. Sable has priorities, Eli said carefully. Whether that constitutes interests in a meaningful sense is a philosophical question I have been avoiding for about 9 months. That produced something from Dreth that Eli was almost certain was the Veth equivalent of a very quiet laugh. The session ended. Eli walked back to his quarters, which were in the human-designated wing of the station, modest and well-organized in the way that Eli organized all spaces he occupied. He sat at the desk and opened the daily report that Sable sent to all Quiet Program veterans who had requested ongoing access. It was detailed and comprehensive, and written in the plain language style that Sable used for all human-readable communications. The key points were methodical and factual. 17 civilizations had now formally adopted the Soul Accords framework. 3 were in advanced discussion. 2 had requested observer status without commitment. 6 had declined participation, but had not taken any action inconsistent with the framework's principles. The Veth Dominion had completed its internal review of the fold drive schematics and had verified their accuracy. They had not yet formally signed the Soul Accords. They were in their 14th round of internal deliberation. The Veth were thorough. The Sathani efficiency modification had been verified and incorporated into the standard schematic documentation. Sable had identified 6 potential sources of future instability in the region, none of which were currently active threats, and all of which were being monitored. It had begun preliminary contingency calculations for each. Nobody had asked it to. It was in its nature. 4 civilizations had independently developed fold-capable vessels using the published schematics. 3 of them had conducted their initial positional exercises in uninhabited space, consistent with the mutual deterrence principle. 1 had positioned vessels in a way that Sable flagged as ambiguous, and was currently in contact with that civilization's technical leadership about the operational guidelines. Eli read through all of it and sat with it for a moment. He thought about the Oort cloud, about the running lights of 4,300 ships that had been built in silence and cold and patience, about the 1.4 seconds between activation and detection, about Phoebe Grant's voice giving him percentage updates while the fold drives prepared. He thought about what those ships had become since. Not weapons, not war. Furniture. The most important furniture in the known galaxy, sitting behind 4,000 Veth ships in a formation that held its position not through aggression, but through the simple, persistent logic of mutual awareness. You knew where we were, we knew where you were, and the knowing changed everything about what either of us was willing to do next. He thought about the question the Veth attaché had asked him last week, the one about humanity's natural state. He had answered it with the truth that had felt most honest in the moment. Neither warlike nor peaceful, adaptive. He would have added something, if the conversation had continued. He would have said that the adaptation was not random. It was not merely reactive, the way a startled animal adapts to immediate danger. It was structured and deliberate and enormously patient. Humanity adapted toward survival, not survival of the individual or the moment or the generation. Survival in the long sense, the sense that stretched past any single person's lifetime, past any single crisis. past any specific enemy or threat or circumstance. Sable was the most concentrated expression of that tendency that humanity had ever built. A system that planned for what had not happened yet, and monitored what others would ignore, and prepared contingencies for scenarios that might never occur. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a machine built in the image of the quality that had kept humanity alive through all the times it should have ended. Eli closed the report and looked out the narrow window of his quarters at the stars. The station was quiet at this hour. The Veth section had a different shift schedule than the human section, which created an overlap period in the late hours where both sides were operating at reduced capacity, and the corridors of the shared spaces had a particular quality of stillness that Eli had come to appreciate. He had asked his sister, on his last visit home, if she felt any different about the galaxy than she had before the engagement. She had thought about it for a moment, and said that she felt watched. He had expected her to say that felt uncomfortable. She had said, unexpectedly, that it was the opposite. Being ignored was comfortable in a specific way that carried its own hidden cost. You did not have to perform, did not have to account for yourself, did not have to be ready for anyone. Being watched meant responsibility, yes, and exposure, and the permanent possibility of being misunderstood or misrepresented. But it also meant being real, to something outside yourself, to the wider thing that contained you. Eli had thought about that ever since. He looked at the stars. All the stars he had looked at from the Oort cloud, which were the same stars, which looked different now, in the way that all things look different when you are no longer alone in front of them. He thought about the silence he had lived in for 11 years, and the silence he was living in now, and whether they were the same silence. They were not the same. The first silence was the silence of building something in secret, in the hope that it would work, in the knowledge that you could not know if it would, in the discipline of not asking for confirmation that was not available. It was a working silence, purposeful, and weighted. The silence outside his window now was something else. It was the silence of a gallery before an exhibition opens, the silence of a space that has been arranged to receive something, not empty, ready. Phoebe Grant had messaged him earlier in the day. She was running the shelf's decommission coordination and would be finished in another 3 months, after which she had been offered a position on a deep space technical exchange program, the first to include both human and non-human engineering staff. She was considering it and had asked for his honest assessment. He had written back, "Take it. The work that remains is not the work we know how to do yet. That is exactly when it should be done." She had sent back a single word, obvious. He smiled at it again now, in the quiet of the station's late hours. He put his hand flat on the cool surface of the window, the same gesture he had made at the shelf when the ships were preparing to fold. Something about the cold steadiness of a solid surface when the future was moving too fast to hold. The stars were outside. The galaxy was outside. All the civilizations that had watched a human fold drive program materialize around a Veth Armada in 1.4 seconds and had spent the 9 months since trying to understand what that meant. It meant many things. The technical papers would take years to catalog them all. The political implications would take decades to fully resolve. The cultural exchange that Dr. Singh was already conducting with Veth intelligence officers, the question about how species experienced uncertainty, would take longer still, and would probably produce something neither side could currently predict. But the simplest version of what it meant was the thing Vasquez had said to him in a brief message 3 weeks after the engagement, a message that was not an official communication and did not appear in any record. She had written, "We did not win a war, we changed what war was worth." He had read it 4 times and agreed with every word of it and said so. In the station around him, 47 humans and 61 Veth conducted their separate evening routines, separated by a corridor and connected by a shared structure they had built together, in a region of space that used to be defined by who was the strongest and was now being defined by something considerably more complicated and considerably more durable. Eli Okoro looked at the stars until the station's lights dimmed to sleep cycle and the corridor outside his door went quiet, and then he did something he had not done in 11 years without discipline and purpose and the specific weight of an enormous secret. He went to bed without an unresolved problem. It was, he thought, as he closed his eyes, a remarkable thing. For the first time, in a very long time, the silence had nothing left to hide.